What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and today we're going to be looking at a Pioneer deck list that kind of can take its origins from Return to Ravnica block standard, where we had the mono blue tempo deck. Obviously, if you play during that time, mono blue was super annoying to play with, especially when Ravnica Allegiance came out, and the deck just kind of like full throttled, like threw itself into the top of the meta game. And this deck is pretty much the same in that it merges some of the spirits elements along with the tempo-ness that you get from like the mono blue decks. So before we get into the mono blue spirits deck that 7-0 the Pioneer Challenge, I just want to remind everyone that if you are not currently subscribed to the channel, that you subscribe to the channel. Uh, I post a lot of videos. I go over a lot of different decks in depth on the Pioneer and Modern format, staples of the metagame, and eventually, hopefully, going in some different deck lists as well. Maybe some like off the beaten path, some brews, and things like that. And of course, we have other like theory videos and stuff. I go over like what Pioneers Masters could possibly look like, staples for modern, things like that. So if that's stuff that you're interested in, always leave a like on the videos and consider subscribing today so you know when I post those videos. So with that shilling out of the way, let's go look into the Mono Blue Spirits deck for Pioneer. And starting off, basically what makes this deck very powerful is kind of what made some of the blue tempo decks powerful way back in the day, and that is the card Curious Obsession. Put it in Rivals of Ixalan, it enchants a creature, and it gives a creature +1/+1, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. But if you didn't attack with a creature this turn, you sacrifice Curious Obsession. To note, you do not have to attack with the creature. Uh, Enchanted by Curious Obsession, you just have to have attacked with a creature. So kind of a neat little, basically like this card is like very, very good when you're ahead. Kind of hard to keep enabled like when you're behind because you kind of have to throw a creature potentially into the abyss just to be able to keep this thing around. And it is a very powerful effect, especially when you look at the 12 1-drops that the deck plays. So to put Curious Obsession on, we have Ascendant Spirit, which is akin to some of the other spirit creatures that we've gotten from like the Lorwyn block, and I think it's Fate Reforged with Warden of the First Tree. So Ascendant Spirit, you pay snow mana into it and it upgrades itself. You can pay 2 snow mana to make it a 2/3 from its 1 mana 1/1. If you put 3 snow mana into it, if it was a warrior, you put a flying counter on it, it becomes a spirit or angel and becomes a 4/4. And if you put 4 snow mana into it from there, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and it gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it kind of gets its own built-in Curious Obsession. Of course, you're investing essentially 10 mana to get a 6/6 flyer that deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. But of note, you do not have to activate these abilities on your turn. You can do it if you just have available mana. The fact that it is a spirit does enable cards like Geistlight Snare, which if you control a spirit, it essentially becomes a mana leak, and if you have an enchantment like Curious Obsession, it's just a one mana. It's a one mana mana leak, which is very, very good. Obviously, Mana Leak saw standard play when it was legal, and for the longest time was a modern staple up until obviously we had Counterspell and other things like that. So, uh, Dice Light Snare, very powerful in conjunction with like Ascendant Spirit, Mausoleum Wanderer, if it shows up, Spectral Sailor, Rattle Change, Shacklegeist, blah blah blah. All of your creatures are spirits, by the way. I didn't realize that, but they are. So Ascendant Spirit can be very good. Obviously, just a solid turn one play gives you, your 9th through 12th turn one play. I would argue that the other two that we'll go over are better just like turn one plays, but like Ascendant Spirit is definitely a card that can win the game on its own if it goes unchecked. The next 1-drop we have is Mausoleum Wanderer. This one's a little bit more disruptive than Ascendant Spirit and Spectral Sailor. So it's a 1/1 flyer for 1. So it gets the immediate evasion right off the rip. Good to pair it with like Curious Obsession on turn 2, but also a little bit worse in the fact that it's with its ability, you can sacrifice it to counter an instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays X, where X is its power. And when another spirit enters the battlefield you control, it gets +1/+1 till end of turn. So Mausoleum Wanderer, like on turn one, you could play like your second land and then play like an Ascendant Spirit and a Curious Obsession on it, and it'll be hitting for 3 damage and then drawing you a card. And then Curious Obsession, like permanently boosting its power, means that when you sacrifice it, it just automatically, almost all the time, your opponent's got to pay 2 for instance and sorcery spells. It does have its spots where it's kind of like um, a selfless spirit, where selfless spirit you can sacrifice it to give all your creatures indestructible. Mausoleum Wanderer, just countering a spell, can do that in its own way, which is very good. Obviously, just the fact that it's a 1 mana flyer for one, 1 mana flyer for one. That's redundant. Anyway, Mausoleum Wanderer, very good. Can be aggressive. Definitely plays kind of both sides when you need it to. The last one, Spectral Sailor. Another 1 mana, 1/1 flyer. But this one has flash, and you can pay 4 mana to draw a card. Uh, Never really a dead draw if you have obviously 5 mana. You can play a sailor and then like end step draw a card, you know, and then just get to untap things like that. Also really good at holding a Curious Obsession. Doesn't have like the clause where like if you want to sacrifice it, then you have to get rid of the Curious Obsession. Your opponent does have to deal with the Spectral Sailor. But with the obsession on it, and the fact that this thing does have flying, most of the time it's going to be able to get in, hit for 2, draw you a card, and then of course once you start, hitting your land drops every turn, Spectral Sailor becomes very hard to kill. Um, so those are the 1 drops, all really powerful, can be aggressive, and especially paired with like a Curious Obsession, very very good. And we'll get to that combination because we already went over it with Geist Light Snare. You could play one of these cards on turn one, put a Curious Obsession on it turn two, and then you have a negate or a mana leak on turn two available to you after you've obviously buffed up one of your spirits. Going on to the other creatures, the next 12 creatures, the other half of them are 2 drops, and they all have different utilities. Uh, Supreme Phantom, probably having the least utility of all of them. It's just a Lord 1/3 flyer for 2. Very good. Definitely blocks a lot of like the prowess things pretty easily. Is gonna probably generate some 2-for-1s, and obviously the X1 creatures or like 2/1s and 1/1s, whatever, aren't gonna be able to beat this that easily. And of course, paired with other Supreme Phantoms is just going to make it harder to kill 2/2/4s, or 3/3/5s because Supreme Phantom honestly gets gross. Of course, pairs well with like Mausoleum Wanderer, permanently buffing its power, which means that when you sacrifice it, they have to pay more, which is always good. Shacklegeist can only be blocked with creatures with flying. It's a 2 mana 2/2 flyer, and you can tap 2 untapped spirits you control to tap a creature you don't control. This could be a way that you can push through damage. Obviously, if you just like at a board stall and you have a board full of spirits and your opponent just has like the same amount of creatures, like you can easily just like tap your untapped creatures to get rid of some of their bigger threats. Even mess up like combat where, before they get to declare attackers, you can tap down their things so then they can't get an attack and then you can crack back and more than likely kill them. Especially with like a lot of other decks not really playing very many flyers to my knowledge. Having Shacklegeist just tap down the flyers, get in with your flyers, being able to take a hit from them if they choose to swing and then kill them on the crackback is always good. And Shacklegeist definitely gives you that utility on top of also being just a 2 mana 2/2 with some evasion. Rattle Chains is probably the most interesting of the 2 drops. Not for the fact that like it's weird or niche or anything like that. It does really well at like protecting your spells. It also has this mysterious text at the bottom of it that I never realized it had literally until this moment as I'm recording this video. So it's a 2 mana 2/1, has flash, so you can obviously play on your opponent's turn. Has flying. When it enters the battlefield, target spirit gains hexproof until end turn. Obviously, you can fizzle some removal spells, some targeted removal on some of your spirits. And at the very bottom, you may cast spirit spells as though they had flash. So when you play like a Rattle Chains, you're able to hold up cards like Shacklegeist and Supreme Phantom, and of course all of your other, your Mausoleum Wanderers and your Ascendant Spirits on your opponent's turn. Rattle Change definitely gives you this angle where like a lot of your deck can play at instant speed, or at least a decent amount of it, and like Rattle Chains and Spectral Sailor, and then obviously getting your cards like Slip Out the Back, Lofty Denial, and Geistlight Snare. Rattle Change just basically unlocks the rest of your creatures and basically makes like Curious Obsession the only card that you really can't play at instant speed. But either way, like you don't want to be doing that anyway. Well, I mean, it'd be cool if you could, but it's definitely not necessary. So Rattle Chains definitely unlocks a dimension of this deck that it goes from like a deck that if you get behind on it super quickly, you're gonna have a hard time, and especially hard to get even and even get ahead of this deck when it just gets to play all of its things at instant speed, gets to leave up counter spells, and then if you don't play anything worth countering, it just gets to fill the board with a bunch of creatures that it can then pair a Curious Obsession with, or sink its mana into with like Ascendant Spirit. Um, Speaking of like the last of the spells, 'cause I've rambled on about the creatures, all their utilities, things like that. We have 9 other spells in this deck. We went through Geistlight Snare, pretty extensively, so I'm not going to go over that. Lofty Denial is essentially a counter spell. I mean, it's a 2 mana counter target spell unless controller pays 1. If you control a creature with flying, you counter that spell unless they pay 4. Most of the time, they're not going to be able to pay 4. If the game goes pretty late, like this deck, really its only way of like getting ahead is like Ascendant Spirit and maybe like chaining Curious Obsessions and things like that together. Just getting to draw the amount of cards, but cards like Lofty Denial most of the time are just going to be hard counters because your opponent is not very likely not going to be able to pay 4 for it. Um, then Slip Out the Back, you put a counter on a creature, it phases out. This card can be used as offense and defense as well. So you could use it defensively by uh, casting this on one of your creatures. Obviously, it ends up getting bigger. You fizzle the removal spell, whatnot. Or you could even block and then phase it out of combat to save it, and save yourself some potential damage in combat. Or on the flip side, you could use it to your opponent's creatures, and if they have a blocker in the way, you just slip out the back the blocker, and then you attack, and more than likely you're attacking for game. Or it's putting you so far ahead that like any one of your other creatures is lethal, that them coming back with a counter really doesn't matter when you just have a board full of lethal threats. So definitely something to keep note of when playing this deck. That Slip Out the Back, just because it puts a counter on a creature, does not mean that all it is good for is taking care of like your own creatures and protecting them. You can use it aggressively as well, even though it'll probably come up more often that you'd be using it defensively than offensively. The utility is there, and this card is sneakily really good in this deck. Finally, the mana base for Faithless Haven goes well with like cards like Ascendant Spirit. Obviously, it doesn't really doesn't cast any of your other things. That's why you play 18 snow-covered islands. But Faceless Haven gives you an aggressive creature. I mean, for 3 mana, you get a 4/3 with Vigilance, so you can still have the mana from the land, which means that given enough time that the game goes late, possibly you could attack with like Faceless Haven and like Ascendant Spirit, and then you'd be able to activate Ascendant Spirit's ability. Um, Otawara seems to show up in like a lot of the blue decks, at least one copy of it, and that's probably all you need is one copy. Uh, Taps for blue mana, so if you need to play as a land, you can. Also, just bounces something. Teferi is super annoying, and I mean 3 mana Teferi is just super annoying to deal with. Otawara gives you a way to instant speed deal with said Teferi without having to commit more resources to the board and in combat as well. Giving you that ability to rebuild even after like a Teferi if need be. Um, as I just said, 18 snow-covered islands, 18 snow-covered islands, for the fact that we just play this crazy amount of blue deck, and Ascended Spirit needs the snow mana to activate its abilities. Sideboard, you have cards like Witness Protection, just makes a creature a 1/1 and gives it the best name in Magic, Legitimate Business Person. At least for a creature, legitimate business person is probably like one of the best names you could give it, especially if there's like a token for this too. That'd be really sweet. This is just like a 1 mana enchantment. Obviously pairs well with like Geistlight Snare, because it's able to become a full negate or a mana leak, not a negate, a mana leak on the early turns of the game, and makes it very makes it very easy to keep pushing damage and hard for a 1/1 to block some of your 2/2s and 3/3s and things like that. There's probably other like uses for it as well. Obviously gets rid of like the huge threats, I would say, by also getting rid of all its abilities. But, do this as you will. It's just a very, very versatile card to be playing in this deck. Aether Gust, Mono Green Ramp is still probably king of the format. It's at least the most played deck by that stretch. So just getting to tempo them out is kind of the name of the game, and Aether Gust allows you to do that to set up like a counter spell for the next turn. Disdainful Stroke, same reason. Mono Green is king. There's probably some other decks that you could bring in Disdainful Stroke against. I think the control decks go pretty big, so you could probably use Disdainful Stroke against them, but um, also has applications against the Mono Green Devotion deck. Unlicensed Hearst, people still like playing Phoenix. Phoenix, I think, is still a very fine archetype to play, even with unlicensed Hearst running around. This deck in particular, I think, can tempo out the opponent in such a way that, like, getting to play an unlicensed Hearst early and then just, like, manage the graveyard while also getting to counter, like, the ways that those decks want to put cards in their graveyard um, ends up being very, very good for the deck. And of course, the hearse just ends up getting super big, easy to crew at crew 2, and can beat your opponent down super quick, especially in those Phoenix matchups. Brazen Borrower, Mystical Dispute, Brazen Borrower, just getting to unsummon a non-land permanent opponent controls, essentially just a 2-mana way of like dealing with like a problematic creature, and getting a 3/1 flyer at instant speed is just another angle of attack this deck has and beats down a lot faster, regardless of help. Uh, the only thing that's unfortunate about it is that it is not a spirit, but everything else it does is what you want from this tempo deck. Mystical Dispute, also just really good against like the blue base decks. Counter target, it costs 2 less to cast if the target spell that you're going to counter is blue, and it's a mana leak at that point, which of course is just good enough on its own. Just a 1 mana. We know 1 mana mana leak is very good because Geist Light Snare, some amount of the time, is a 1 mana leak, which again, always good. I don't know how many times I could say it's good. Just play it, please. So that's the Mono Blue Spirits deck. I really like this deck. I actually think it would be really fun to play. It gets a little difficult with mono red being like popular. I think this is a deck that like can beat mono green if you have like those traditional starts of just like turn one thing into like turn two obsession, and then you're able to like protect it with slip out the back, or if you're able to hold up like a Geist Light Snare, from there, like you can just kind of like leave up 1 to 2 counter spells, generate card advantage, hit your land drops, and make it very hard for your opponent to win the game when they finally get into a position to maybe like kind of bring the game even. Um, but yeah, that's my feelings for the Mono Blue Spirits deck. Really cool, definitely worth a try. If you like this deck, and or if you play it and you're watching this, let me know in the comments that you do. I would love to talk about it because this is a deck that I am thinking about playing just because I was a big fan of like the mono blue decks in Standard back in Ravnica Allegiance. But yeah, that's gonna do it for me in this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. Of course, comment. Love reading comments. Love replying to them. All that fun stuff. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Again, I post deck techs all the time, Pioneer, Modern, some of my own theory videos, and just kind of explaining why things are good, bad, indifferent, etc., etc. So if you would, please consider subscribing. Makes me happy on top of all that stuff, and everyone loves a happy Dakota. So that's gonna do it for me for the third time. Thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next video.